Who's going to hear some jazz later this week? Great. First, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about open source and sort of my journey and my experience building the Siri platform at Apple. So I hope you stick around, and then we go listen to some jazz. First and foremost, I think we all like to talk about DevOps. This is a slide that Gartner produces. They put this up there to try to compare the old way of doing things with the new way of doing things. This is another one that Gartner puts up. I don't really understand why this makes sense. And I struggled a lot after I left Apple coming out into a company like EMC and then later in Dell as to the fact that we've labeled ourselves as DevOps engineers. What is DevOps? Why am I labeled as DevOps? I remember walking through the show floor with my CMO at the time, and he said to me, oh, this is our hyperconverged, this is our DevOps, this is that. And I had to ask him, I was like, what do you mean DevOps? And as he explained it to me, I just thought to myself, I thought everybody just did it infrastructure this way. I thought they just did it. And so it became clear to me that because there was no real definition, I would have to offer up my own definition of what a DevOps engineer or a DevOps organization looks like. And so I submit to you this picture. I think we see that the old way of doing things is on the left side. How many people are wearing those shoes here today? One guy. All right. I don't mean anything personal by it, but and then how many people are wearing the Converse and the Kicks, which apparently I'm wearing today too? Many more people. So this is my view of DevOps. This is my view of what this new persona, this new type of engineer, this new method of doing open source at very, very large companies and at scale. I think also, if I asked all of you in the audience today what DevOps meant to you, or if you offered me up a definition, and I usually do this interactively with a smaller group, but I think you all would offer up a different story or a different opinion. Some of you would talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery. Maybe I'd hear about infrastructure as code. Maybe I'd hear even about agile programming. But what I'd really like to be able to do is offer you up my definition. My definition is that DevOps is applying software development principles to operations. I think that sort of brings everything together. It brings in continuous integration, brings in agile, brings in all these principles. And if you think about it, that really is the spirit of DevOps. For decades now, we've worked on software development, we've checked in code, we've done code reviews, we've done these sorts of things. And then the code gets built or instantiated or realized. And if the code ships and goes out to production and we see a problem, what do? We revert the code back to the previous version, or we file another bug and we move along. Well, there's no reason why we can't take those types of principles and apply them to operations. And so I thought a little bit about who I was and the type of work that I did at Siri. For those of you that aren't aware, Siri, when I left a few years ago, was 100,000 servers. We started with 0 servers 5 years prior. So in a 5-year period of time, we went from 0 servers to 100,000 servers. And I thought about this sort of transformation of this journey we went on and reflected a little bit about what was important to me at that time. One was not embarrassing Steve Jobs on stage. That was the first one. Yeah, right? You don't want to do that and then make the Wall Street Journal the next day. That's not a good way to go. But first and foremost, I valued interoperability. I wasn't so concerned with how fast my storage was or what CPUs I was running. I didn't care so much about gigabytes and gigabits and network. I just wanted everything to work together. I valued interoperability. I also valued the ability to leverage a community. When we started, there were 5 of us on the operations team, and in January, my boss came to me and said, Josh, go build the data centers for Siri. We said, great. When's the software going to be ready? How many users are we going to have? I asked all those nerdy engineering questions. And he had no answers for me, and he finally just looked at me and said, you should be fiscally responsible, and good luck. And that was my guidelines that we set out with. So we valued tremendously the ability to leverage a collaborative community. We were not aligned to job titles. I did not have some fancy title. I think I was individual contributor 5, whatever that meant. But more importantly, in order to work at that scale, we practiced DevOps. I thought again later about how we made the decisions around the infrastructure that we did. And for whatever reason, I thought about my old psychology class and Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And to what extent Maslow studied this idea to what extent human beings could be self-actualized or reach their maximum potential. And the nerd in me decided that I was going to apply this to infrastructure. I know all of you are like, whoa, really? But I came up with this idea that in an effort to sort of build a scalable, interoperable infrastructure, you had to solve each problem of this pyramid moving bottom up. If you start in the middle and try to work your way out, or if you skip levels in the infrastructure, you find, for example, that you're not really self-actualized, or you're not able to run a certain class of applications. These were some key principles that we thought about as we were building. We started with one of the world's largest, I believe the world's largest VMware and virtual machine environment, and then in 9 months' time, transitioned the entire infrastructure from that to containers. This was right around the time the Apple Watch was coming out, if you guys are interested in the timing. A few things here. This idea around the third platform is this evolved platform. This is the DevOps platform. And what makes it different from sort of the legacy ways that we had built on infrastructure before? First, you provide an abstraction of the infrastructure away from the application. I got to tell you, it's not going to work well when you walk into a room full of developers and you say, hey, we're going to change the whole infrastructure out from underneath you, and for the next 9 months, you can't push any updates whatsoever. This sounded like a reasonable idea going into that conversation, but it wasn't. And so this idea that you can create this abstraction that abstracts the developers or abstracts the application owners from the rest of the infrastructure gives you the ability and the agility to change it out from underneath you. Let's see. I like to offer up this little video about what DevOps means visualized. We talk a lot about it. We talk about this linear way of developing software and releasing infrastructure. But to me, I think DevOps is a continuous model, right? It folds back onto itself. And so this is the little video I put together to illustrate that to you all. What do you guys think of that? Any feedback? No? Okay, we'll work on it. Okay. I wanted to address a little bit about open source and how we used open source at Apple. Apple is an interesting culture because we were able to consume pretty much anything that we wanted to, but we were unable very little to contribute code back. And I thought a lot about why we adopted open source. Why was open source software so valuable to us? And I threw up several ideas here as to what I've heard from the community, what I've heard from individuals. People talk about it being cheaper or free. Well, for one thing, we were at Apple, and so being fiscally responsible, we weren't really concerned with the cheapest option. We wanted the most interoperable option. We wanted to select the option that got us to the end goal sooner rather than later. One of the funny things about Apple is that when there's a deadline and there's a keynote, you hit the date. You don't get to say, hey, look, I know you want to talk about Siri on stage in front of the rest of the world next week, but the servers they're going to be 3 weeks late. You don't get to miss your dates. So this idea that we were going to pick solutions based on what got us time to market or time to value sooner rather than later was really important. I also quickly learned that if you take the price of closed source software and compare it to support costs of open source software, it actually is the same thing, and in some cases more expensive. So it really wasn't about it being cheaper. And so I offer these 4 ideas. First, I think open source gives you the flexibility to deploy software in a way that meets your needs. You can deploy the software on your laptop. You can deploy software on the cloud, on the servers. You can do it any way you like. And proprietary software doesn't really offer that value. It doesn't really give you that ability. There's all these terms, there's all these conditions, there's all these things that the vendor may or may not allow for you. And then freedom, the freedom and the flexibility to do whatever you want with the software. You can change the software. You can throw the software away. You can take it apart and reassemble it. I think about it this way, and this is the first time I've used this analogy, but imagine if you were buying a Lego kit, and the Lego kit was glued together. And when you bought the Lego kit, that was the only thing that you could build was the figure or the race car. And in fact, you bought it pre-assembled, and you brought it all glued together so that if you didn't like the wheel or if you didn't like this component, you had to take it apart, and you couldn't take it apart. Open source software is exactly the opposite. It's this idea that I buy a box with a bunch of pieces inside of it, or I download a bunch of pieces. That would be cool if we could get to that. And come up with a way to put the pieces together that best fit me, or best fit our use. That's really freedom for me. Here's the instructions, here's sort of what we think you should build, but actually open source allows you to build something that's just more tailored to your use case. The third key thing here is innovation. I think that we could all agree that leveraging a collaborative community of people, thousands of people across the globe, many of the people that you don't ever meet physically, and get their feedback and their level of contribution into a problem space that you haven't thought about. This was really valuable to us. We were building something presumably that nobody had ever built with sets of problems that nobody had ever seen at that scale. But what we learned by consuming open source software was that actually many of the smaller problems that we were running into, many of the smaller issues that we were running into, other people had solved or other people had thought about. So being able to leverage this community of people and leverage this level of innovation from other people got us to market faster. We didn't have to go back to a software vendor and say, hey, these are the 4 problems we've run into, we need you to solve them. I'm sure all of us have filed a bug with a large proprietary software vendor and they say, oh, don't worry, we'll get it to you next quarter. My response to that was always like, I need it tomorrow. Like we're going to be launched, we're going to be on stage, like Siri's going to be shipping next quarter. I need it right now. And so to leverage this level of innovation from an entire group of people gave us some solace that we were actually going to be able to succeed in doing this. And finally, the last point is integration. I touched on this earlier. Integration is the idea that because the software is malleable, because they're Lego bricks, you can move and turn and change them in certain ways so that they integrate with the rest of the pieces that you're building. This was really powerful ultimately, and this was really the guiding choice, and this was the guiding principle when we were buying hardware, when we were designing our data centers, when we were designing Siri itself. How best can we build this platform from the application all the way down to the infrastructure to all integrate seamlessly together? And I think those are the 4 principles of open source software and the 4 true benefits of open source. We call this FIFI, by the way. Our community manager came up with that idea. So the true benefits: freedom, innovation, flexibility, and integration. And I'd like to reiterate, because I hear this all the time, that it's not about cost. Open source software is not cheaper. You pay for it one way or the other. Either you build in the expertise or you pay for support costs from somebody else that knows more about it than you do. I think it's really, really about the integration. Okay, so what did we learn? We'll wrap up. Open source software, I think, has been embraced by organizations that have adopted a DevOps culture. I think we see this more with younger companies that have more on their plate. There's more to do than there are people. And so smaller organizations tend to adopt this faster or more quickly. But you see this all the way up to some of the largest companies in the world, including Apple. Again, it's not about cost. I gave you 2 examples here. If you look at Mirantis and their OpenStack platform and you compare that against VMware, you actually find that the support costs are about the same. Compare your support costs with Red Hat versus Microsoft. I drill this point into your heads because I really hear this all the time from CIOs. They say, open source, we want open source because we want to save money. It's not cheaper. And so finally, whoops, got ahead of myself. Open source software allows you to integrate disparate pieces of infrastructure together to build higher level capabilities. That's really what this is about. And I think why the Lego analogy to me makes a ton of sense. We can take all these pieces of software, we can integrate them together, we can manage the environment as one piece rather than all these siloed pieces of infrastructure. So with that, I think I'm through, and thank you all for your time.